cloud. I love her voice. John, say hello.
Sure. Can you all hear me okay?
Can.
Great. I'm John Manning, practicing physician at Atrium Health in Charlotte, North Carolina, wearing scrubs because I'll have a clinical shift in about 2 hours. I'm also emergency medicine trained as a physician and also boarded in clinical informatics. I am the CEO of MayJune and a physician developer, actually a Google developer expert in the language called Dart and Flutter, of which there's 80 in the world and 9 on our continent and 1 across the globe in healthcare. Like Gray, I took a path of a clinical informatician in large part through frustration from a lot of the tools that we use every day on shift and trying to find ways to make that better from a usability and a human factors perspective, which is why I co-founded MayJune and why I've been building things with this wonderful language in Flutter that connects through Fire. And we'll talk about that as we go.
Cool. I think everybody else has been here before. Brian, you want to provide some of the work group updates? Or
Sure. I think at the moment we have just one big announcement. It happens to be associated with both our user stories / use cases work group and our ontologies work group. The National Science Foundation has had a project called the Open Knowledge Network, in which they have been attempting to identify different domain-specific ontologies, and then solving problems in interoperability between those domains based on those ontologies. And they made a specific request or at least they made a specific request to the NIM, National Information Exchange Model, Program Management Office at the Department of Defense for, hey, do you have some NIM ontologies? Well, the reality is there is no such thing as a NIM ontology yet. There's something we call NIM core, which is a common set of data types and data elements, like what a person is, what a service is, what an organization is. In any case, so the problem was thrown back in our lap, in both Unify's lap with Paul Wormley, who's another one of our members who isn't here today, unfortunately, acting as project manager, to come up with some use cases, some user stories that might enable NIM and information exchange with other types of information domains. And Eric and Sonia and I worked on a couple of those user stories. One was a decarceration user story. We actually, for those of you who are familiar with our personas, our Port Thompson family, that we do such terrible, terrible fictional violence to in order to identify problems that vulnerable persons might come up with. We finally got around to sending Sarah Thompson to jail for her DUI and child come on, mind. What's the
endangerment?
word? Yes, endangerment. Thank you. That was the word I was missing in my available vocabulary, because Jameson had gotten into some of her prescription medicines and had shown up at school high. So we sent her off to jail, simply so that we could turn around and, as part of her release program, put together a decarceration plan that would get her the necessary housing and food and childcare and job training services that she might need in order to, make a successful restart once she's released from incarceration. And Eric came up with a variation on that theme, specifically having to do with reunification of Jameson with his mother, Sarah, focused on child welfare and housing services. My understanding is that in addition to those two Unify-centric use cases, Paul also pulled in an IGIS, the Institute of Justice Information Systems, I believe is how that deacronizes, use case on event response. And he's worked with Georgia Tech, the Georgia Tech Research Institute, to get them to work on a real NEEM ontology based on, at very least, NEEM core, if not all of the 18 or so NEEM domains that are kicking around out there. So this is all very fun and exciting. At very least, the decarceration and reunification proposals, I happen to know, were accepted by the NSF's, National Science Foundation's OKN program. And Eric and Paul and I have been invited to participate in an ongoing set of workshops that I hope won't be more than once a quarter, but we'll see, on better defining what these use cases are in preparation for proposing, doing some actual work, developing these ontologies sometime in fiscal 2023.
Cool.
And so look forward to at least 2 more user stories showing up. And I'm going to drop the current user story catalog into the chat momentarily. But look forward to at least those 2 user stories and any others that we all come up with showing up at a Unify near you.
Well, that'll be helpful.
So Daniel, if I can just give a little segue to John here. I know he's got clinical shift he's got to get to and so forth. Anyhow, I wanted folks to know, I'm Dave Walsh. I was one of the founders of Project Unify. And one aspect of Project Unify that we had focused on was the user experience piece of it. And that's a good deal of what John and Gray are going to talk about in just a moment. And the hope is, both with Open City Labs and Jim St. Clair, that we're going to start working together with some of these groups and putting user experiences onto the capabilities that they have. So John already introduced himself. And John, without further ado, why don't you take it from here so that we don't run out of time?
Sure, that's fine. I'm going to share my screen and please let me know when you see it. Also, my strong preference is for this to be a dialogue rather than a monologue. So please ask questions and I'll be happy to answer them both in the chat as well as just speak up. And I'll also mention that there's I'd say probably about 1/3 of the people that are here that are somewhat aware of these efforts that we're doing, because a lot of these are done in coordination and collaboration with our colleagues and peers that are here. Understanding this is a larger group and something that's also being recorded, my preference is to try and keep some of the content separate. And so I'm being respectful of the content, but also showing how this is interoperable and can scale. And so I'll be happy to answer specifics or things in terms of lessons learned, certainly in terms of where we are right now and in the project at hand, but realistically, as a whole, and do you all see my screen right now?
Yes.
Yes. I love this picture because I think when you're trying to think of the spirit of interoperability, the idea is essentially building blocks that can interchange with one another and that can build upon the shoulders of others. And to date, the efforts that we've built build very heavily upon the spirit of FIRE. We've called this Firefly, and there's a team of people that have done this together for some of the projects that are national, but then there's also an international representation of people that are also building upon the work that we're doing as we're continuing to push further and further. And so I, as an informatician and in a startup of clinical informaticians, find that often it's a bit hard to try and originally go through, well, why are we doing informatics? Why are we even calling this? And how is that even relevant? And just to get at this out of the way, a formal definition of informatics is how you use data, information, and knowledge to improve health and the delivery of healthcare services. And so then the next question is, all right, well, what's the difference between data, information, and knowledge, and why should I care? And the answer is each one is that next level of abstraction and that higher level of complexity that gives you additional insights as you go from raw data to meaning to context to applied, so that you can take additional insights and start connecting the dots and putting things together and be a little bit more future facing rather than what has happened. And keep in mind that a lot of these tools that you're building need to match the level of complexity for the user. So something built for a patient is going to be very different than something built for, a expert user of clinical record systems of some form or fashion. It really needs to match what's there in front of you. And I say all of that because you need to have some sort of aspect that will support the efforts that you're doing. Because if you have none of it, you're going to be stuck all the way down into the weeds. Let's say you're working with Fire, of directly modifying the JSON and the XML just to try and build one thing from scratch. Whereas if you have a lot of these building blocks that help make your job easier, then you can start much higher and work with far more. And the analogy that I like to give for this, and the tools that we use and the tools that we build try to follow the same theme, but think of it like driving a car. You probably don't have to know about spark plugs, piston engines, and all the intricacies of internal combustion to drive. You have some keys, you have your ignition, you turn the wheel, you put it in drive, and you go. And all of the other aspects from there, but you really don't have to go all the way into the depths. And that's the spirit that we've tried to do with Firefly, which literally is fast healthcare interoperability resources with Flutter library integration. And we have formal permission to use this from HL7. It's not an endorsement. It's just, we love the term, and we think it embodies the spirit. And so what is Flutter? Flutter is Google's open source user interface toolkit. And it's, as of December of 2021, has 375,000 apps on the Google Play Store. It's one code base that you can use to build for Android, for iOS, for the web, technically also Linux. It's the default choice for Ubuntu, actually, for Canonical. Mac and PC. And literally at about this time tomorrow, 1 p.m. Eastern, Flutter is about to announce their next version, which is probably going to be full support for Windows, at least given what they've led into. But this is a 3-year-old piece of software that is open source that allows you to build some really cool interfaces without having to know all of the low-level intricacies of how that software is built. And so it really eases that barrier for you to build clean and beautiful designs. And so with Firefly, we take Fire from our data in, which is formatted a number of different ways, and I'll explain that a little bit. We display it in this was with Prepare, which we had built and demoed a calendar year ago, and certainly the efforts that we've done since. And then we display this and connect this through Fire on the outside as well. And to date, we've connected to essentially the Fire servers that we have access to through the same Smart on Fire launches and contexts that we have. So Google Cloud, happy, including interoperability, land and meld, and other aspects from Michigan's Health Information Network, AidBox, Azure, and others. And so high level, what we, in collaboration with many others that are on our call today, have done together with New Jersey is essentially taken a number of industry standards of questionnaires in multiple languages. And for this project, it was 4. For the stuff we did with Prepare, it was 26. Following as much as we could for accessibility and making it easy to use for people that need additional assistance when working on a phone, to build a cross-platform app that allows for custom calculations and translations that are directly embedded into your survey. And so FHIR is the absolute underpinning of everything that we built, where you'll get notifications, you'll open this app, you'll be able to see all the results and everything in the portal, and you go from there. Again, keeping some of the details out while still showing how this can be interoperable and scale. Are there any questions on just that very high level before I kind of explain a little bit more about Firefly and then show the efforts that we've done? No, I explained it perfectly. Okay,
Actually,
great.
could you go back one slide?
Yeah, of course.
Actually, maybe one more back. I just want to make sure that was the one.
Yeah.
So when you advance, you're saying, go to the next slide. Sorry. So where's the user in this? Patient identified.
Here, patients on the right. So you have to think about who your user is for this project. And again, I'm trying to be intentionally vague, but you have one user that is on the clinician side and the people that are coordinating all of those surveys and the results, et cetera. And then you have the patients who are filling this out on their phone, on the web, on their Android phone or their iPhone. And so realistically, when you're looking at the end user of the person that is filling out a questionnaire, the first section is, okay, well, how can we make this as easy as possible to build them? And then how can we make this as clean as possible to display them and to do this in a manner that matches locales? Does that make sense, Daniel?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just need to hear it second time.
Okay. So just a quick bit about what Firefly is, and then to just show how that gets implemented here. So if you think of the resources that are available in FHIR, and when you go to hl7.org/FHIR, what we've essentially done, and this is the primary backbone that we have, is we've taken every part of a resource that exists and the smaller parts that are within it and made it into something that you can easily access in a Flutter application. And so as an example, patient, in code, you can go to patient, your name or your gender or birth date. And so we've essentially turned that into code that then becomes a lot easier to work with while you're building your applications. For an observation, so like a vital sign or a blood pressure, we have the same thing. And for a condition, so either part of your ICD-10 diagnosis or a patient-generated health concern, we've essentially made that whole thing available. And for all of the versions that currently exist, R4, STU3, DSTU2, and the R5 draft, including all the testing that's also associated with HL7. We've included ways to make things easier for you to do smart on FHIR authentication, to work with bulk data, and even to try and make it a little bit easier if you're working with US Core for data interoperability as well. And we give examples both on the website and on GitHub, as well as on Meijune's website. And so essentially what we have built to date, and just looking through this is one example demographic of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questionnaires. And each of those questionnaires essentially exists as its own separate resource that's accessed from the FHIR server, which has the language translation that's embedded into it, so that you can then, you can open this up, you'll have checkboxes, you can have essentially the radio buttons, you can have sliders, you can have text that you can enter in, and you'll see an overall general, where am I in terms of what I've done? And after everything is done, you'll get a check mark that says it's all complete. again, the questions themselves and the things that we're filling out as we're going through this, and so you'll see that that's checked, are less important than what is, like, how this is generated and how this can scale. And so the way that we generate all of the text that is here that is not specific to FHIR is we are using one spreadsheet on Google, a Google Sheet, and we by default have equals Google Translate. But if you decide that you want to actually put in custom information and text that's there, we run our script, everything gets updated, and you essentially have all of the language translations as easily accessible as one can do for all of the content that exists within the app. Similar to that idea, we have also abstracted out the means by which we build the questionnaires, so that, again, the language translations are also embedded. But if you want something that is, if you wanted to switch something from a radio button to a checkbox, or you had some, information that was going to be a value that's like a number, 1 through 5 or something along those lines, but then you wanted to switch that over to a slider, you literally just have to make changes to this questionnaire or like this spreadsheet, including the language translations, which are also embedded into this. We run the script, and then this gets updated. And so what that means for the efforts that we've done with New Jersey, and when fully complete and implemented, will be to screen 140,000 children across 16 different age groups. And so essentially we are building 16 different versions of these questionnaires, which, if you think of every one of these groups or buttons or something being its own individual thing, turns out to about 550 separate dynamically rendered question or group or display or consent language or something along those lines for the entirety of this application. Granted, there's a lot of overlap with some of the questions if it's viewed for a 12-year-old versus a 6-year-old, et cetera. But the high level is we've essentially made the ability to create a questionnaire that then gets rendered in FHIR that crosses language translations to be dynamically rendered in a cross-platform app, including additional translations that are available for essentially whatever language we want. And you can start, it's not great for questions to do equals Google Translate, but you can definitely get that as you're getting up and running. And then let's say you need something in German as an example, then you reach out to somebody who is a native German speaker or has the ability to help translate and make sure that everything makes sense. From your perspective, this is a lot easier to work with, just as you're trying to manage and define the content. And what we are doing on our side is trying to make it as easy as possible to have that display available for the patient in a cross-platform manner. So that's what we've done. We had originally submitted Prepare at the very beginning to ACL Social Care Referrals Challenge. There were 80 groups that were a part of that. We are lucky to have made it past both round 1 and round 2 in collaboration with Open City Labs. Now there's, you went from 80 to 8 down to 4 to essentially continue to build on the efforts that that we're doing. And again, to try and do this in a manner that, as I mentioned from before, I think this is the most important, because there will be overlap from the efforts that we are doing and the efforts that others are doing working with the tools that we've built. But at the same time, if we really want something to be interoperable, I think it makes sense to build something that is easily interchangeable, that can follow the standards, of course, so that we're all communicating on the same language, and then can do this in a manner that can apply into different locations and in different settings. And so that's, I think, the high level and a little bit down into the weeds overview of some of the stuff that we've done, some of the stuff that we're building, and what we're looking at as we're moving forward. Are there any questions on that part, or where we are at least right now?
have you put this in front of people who are users, and have you had users of it on your design team?
So great question. We have, this is being, and it's an early pilot of right now in a clinical setting, but it is being utilized by patients in a clinical setting. And, you know, a lot of the updates and feedback, et cetera, as we're building this stuff forward, have been given to us. And certainly we're making this as useful as possible as we can for the end user, so they have as few barriers to entry. To Rita's question about our questionnaire outputs and responses going anywhere, that's a great question. The responses that we are using, and we've done this in at least with the general code in 2 ways. So we're storing them on Fire servers. We've connected to, you know, for the demo that I'm talking about, we've connected to Google Health's healthcare API, but just as well, we've connected to interoperability lands, Meld servers, and Azure and others. And so essentially what happens is when you fill out the questionnaire, it will generate a questionnaire response. And in one of the examples that we had given with Prepare, we had some of those responses directly trigger a health concern. So, Sarah Thompson fills out, I am concerned about food and housing insecurity, and that immediately creates something on her problem list as a patient-generated concern about food security and a patient-generated concern about housing security. For the efforts that we've done with New Jersey, it was a lot more complex in terms of, there were some that were, direct answer needs to have direct thing that triggers this is something that needs to be addressed right now. But some of them were also scored based on an amalgam of question answers. And so we've also included this thing called Fire Path, which is a development language by the people that are in Fire, that created Fire, to allow you to use complex scoring to also generate these same answers. And we provide that workflow here, which also includes like service requests and the task, and it kind of gives that high level overview of what this looks like on the back end without going into any of the details. But essentially, yeah, that is where our efforts are connecting into.
This is John speaking. This is it was a great demo. Thank you. And in my line of work, I am trying to do something that is very similar to what you demoed here on the front end with respect to questionnaires and assessments, and at back end, building a set of models and decision mechanisms to react to the answers you get. And in doing so, I was in search for a tool or solution that can help to connect the front end and the back end. So this is seems very relevant and useful. So look forward to learning more about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. And Daniel, it's been a while saying hi to you, and thank you for this forum and the introduction. Thank you.
Can't wait to learn.
Yeah, Fire Path is where you should, that would be the breadcrumb to start through. Gray, Falconberry, and we have a Slack channel where a lot of the people that are global that are also working on these Fire packages also join and ask questions, and we try and help each other as best we can in that regard. And one of our colleagues, a guy named Tilo and Gray, are the ones that are actively developing and making sure that Fire Path is as useful as possible. And part of that is the complex scoring, but also part of it is as an example, in part of the consents where the question is, hey, can I have access to this? I authorized myself to be able to share this and to go through this. The consent language is being used as it's a Fire questionnaire, but your name is automatically getting pulled in also through Fire Path. And so there's other things that you can do in addition to just scoring with that scripting language. Otherwise, you would have to generate, for I think we were talking about Sarah Thompson, and I'll just say Joe Thompson, and we'll say Gary. So if you needed to have a questionnaire that is individual for Sarah, for Joe, and for Gary, you would have to generate that questionnaire separately for each one. But if you use FirePath, then you can have the things that pull in their information. And you're only using one questionnaire, and it gets rendered as needed. So that's another really powerful thing that you can do with that.
Great.
John, Rita has a question in terms of provenance.
Yeah, I'll read it out. I see it in the chat. How is patient-generated health data provenance distinguished from clinician or other actor filling out questionnaires on behalf of the person? Which is an excellent question. The way that you are logging in to the needs assessment tool app, the app that we've created, which is now Health Story. So the way that you log into this is you as the person, and you can have a specific task that is assigned to you to be filled out on behalf of somebody else. And so a good example of this also is you have somebody who is 17 years old or 16 years old. Is it the 16-year-old that's filling it out themselves, or is it the parent that's filling it out on behalf of the 16-year-old? And depending on who is logging in, that will be connected in Fire based on essentially the glue of the task, which kind of keeps all of this stuff together. You're able to keep that information as a Fire reference so that you can make sure that the information that is being recorded is one that is, who the actor is that's creating that info. Does that make sense?
Take her
So,
silence
John-
as a yes.
John, I don't
Quiet
want to
crowd.
put
Oh, wait. There's a not exactly. Okay.
Maybe Greg can explain it better than I, but I will. Here, let me just
I
share.
can,
Yeah,
I can try. There's two different pieces to it. There's the user piece, which is that when the service request is created, it is assigned to someone specific. So it is either assigned to the patient or it is assigned to the parent. And so when they get a link, it is emailed or texted to either the parent or the child's phone number. And so with that, there is a one-time password that goes along. So when they log in, we know who it is that's going to be filling it out because it is assigned to them. And so that's kind of the workflow answer. And then within the Fire resources themselves, as John said, there are two fields. There is in a task, there is a field called FOR, which is who the task is in reference to. And so that always is the patient. And then there's another field that is responsible for, now I can't remember, owner. There we go.
Owner.
Yeah. And that can either be the patient themselves, if they're an adult or a 17-year-old that is filling it out themselves, or if it's a child and the parent is filling it out for them, then the owner is a related person. And so that's how kind of Fire stores that information to reference later.
And on your side, if I'm a parent and I log in, my login is, that's it. This is my login and this stuff is already set. Versus if I'm somebody else, you get correct. So in the task, the owner is the person that is actually filling the stuff out, and the FOR is the person that is the one to whom this information is directly related. So you can be the owner and also FOR at the same time. So there's an association with some identifier that identifies which the person completing the task as owner. Yes, that's correct. What is the system of record for the Fire resources, i.e. where the information is collected to potentially being disseminated to other systems? I guess your question is as in what type of Fire server are we harnessing, or is the question, am I misinterpreting that question, Thomas?
No, just if there is a single collection point for this information, or if it's being kept in some sort of federated fashion. If the so for example, if somebody needs to the answers to these questions are being stored in fire resources and someone needs to react to them, is there a central location where that information is being aggregated and acted upon? Or is there some sort of a federated model that you're using?
Central location is a fire server is the way that we have this set up, not a federated model. And to date, we've connected to the 6 different fire servers that we have access to. So we've done this with Happy, for example, and we've done this with 8box and Meld, et cetera. But we are using one fire server to have centrally located data, which includes both the questionnaires. In the questionnaires have your language translations directly embedded into them. It includes the information that is related to what's being filled out now, which is essentially this task. That think of that as like the progress bar of everything that's happening as a whole, and includes the responses and the scoring. So it's all centrally located. There's no federation of this, at least not the way that we have this defined. But if you can connect through Fire, because Fire is the standard through which this can be translated, if you can do that in a federated fashion, there's nothing to stop you from to working through that workflow as well.
Hey, John. Thanks for your presentation. It's always great. And obviously as your partner, OpenSea Labs, and I'm familiar with this, but I learn something every time. I had a question about the workflows and what you're seeing in the field. Are you able to get more information about what workflows on the human side are getting most successful responses, i.e. the person gets a text message and then they actually click through and fill out the information, create an account. Maybe if that comes from, the YMCA, that they're having a very high response rate, but if they come from this environment, they're not having as much of a high response rate. So that's one. And then the other question was just around, from that perspective of who is getting the invite, the patient, the child themselves, or some kind of adult. Are you familiar with kind of what's going into that decision-making process? Because I know there are a lot of complex consent issues associated with parents accessing their child's medical record under these circumstances, but not under those circumstances. Things that OCL is going to have to deal with in due time as well.
Yeah. So in terms of the first question, we're still early in pilot implementation, so we don't have that data yet in terms of I'll just say click-through rates or utilization rates across the various locations. Regarding the questions themselves and who fills this out, at least right now, it's we've established 4 different ways where this can be addressed. Essentially, if this is the primary one is a parent filling this out on behalf of the child. The second is parent and child together. The third is I'll just say older child, or we'll just say the parent is not available, and just so that you're 13 to 17 years old, and the final is young adult 18 to 20. And so we built those workflows for all 4 in a manner that met with the compliance and standards, et cetera. This is always a work in progress and process, and there's going to be variations based on state, based on health system, as to how that can even be utilized or what level of depth needs to go into in terms of consent and whom is filling this out. And without going too much in the weeds, if you're thinking this from a high level perspective, can you make it so that one person is filling this out on behalf of somebody else with a different variation as to whether or not they have access to the some of the answers that are being shared and things along those lines? The answer is absolutely yes. And you can even build some of that stuff into the questionnaire. A good example, there's one question that you have to answer as to whether or not you want this questionnaire response group to be available to the provider for sharing before you fill out the other questions. And that essentially triggers whether or not this response is going to be something that can be shown and visualized. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can do this, harnessing the efforts within Fire. Again, this is where, I can only show to where we are, and or at least kind of give that high level picture. But this is something that I think a lot of the lessons that we are literally learning now can absolutely be applied in other projects moving forward.
I would also say though that I think that the technical piece is often the easier piece to deal with in this respect. It's once you have a decision, then we have to figure out, okay, how do you technically block data from people that you don't want to have access to? But that's not a new problem. We do that all the time with different groups and allowing whoever to access certain data, not others. There's lots of stuff out there about that. And so for us, I say for us, it was much more Christine, where the burden fell of trying to figure this out, because it's what do you have access to, who has access to it, and how are you going to define that, and then what sort of permissions are you going to allow them to have control over? So technically, it's not easy. It's a challenge, but it's at least been answered multiple times in other arenas. The bigger challenge, I think, is generally deciding where you're going to draw the boundaries and what the rules are, because a lot of times they're not clear. And kind of what age you can start doing some of this is maybe a little bit clear, but then what you share with whom is always a mess. Adolescents are really, really challenging for just this reason, to try to figure out what you're going to share with whom. And so I think the non-technical piece of this is actually the much bigger issue to try to deal with.
Across the entire Inc. project, at least the aspects that I know about, we are far from, and I'm not going to speak for all of Inc., but from where I know where ODH is, there is plans to support the patient accessing their own data, but none of the technology systems are kind of ready for that. And it's at that point where some of the consent questions around, although an adult has the ability to access the minor of their child's record, the exceptions are, except for if there is pregnancy data or SUD data and a few others, then we'll all be grappling with some of these more nuanced patient access to their own data issues. And so we look forward to working with you guys on that.
Absolutely. Great questions.
Jim, I'm not sure I understood your question or your statement. Would you elaborate? I guess he's chosen not to. Okay, that's fine. So it's a work in progress. That's great. It's in flight. Very exciting stuff in terms of information capture. I'm real interested in how people interact with it in terms of, and one question, people use this once, right? They fill out the assessment more than once ever?
Yeah, so 6 months, a year later, you'll fill it out again. You'll have a different login or a different ID. It'll still be tied to your email or your phone number, and you get a one-time passcode. So you just get a reminder, oh, you have an upcoming appointment for your 2-year. Thanks for filling out your 18 months or whatever. And here's your login, and you just fill some of those questions out. And the questions that you see will be unique to that age group. There will be some that overlap, but for the most part, the thing that you fill out next time, and then the next time and the next time, you just you do your one-time login, and you're shown the things that are relevant for that specific question group that need to be filled out.
And so then there's the record of the last answers are maintained over time?
Yeah, and that's a whole separate discussion of how this is viewed on the portal from the perspective of the people that are coordinating these questionnaires, and how you can see those responses as well as look back through prior responses. But all that stuff is in flight. So if I, as a good example on a patient, and we're too early for this in real patients, but if I send a questionnaire group, fill it out for a patient, have everything filled, and then that's all done and closed, I can later send a separate request that then you can fill out, and I can see between the different responses. And all this stuff gets stored on Fire, which is the beauty of using something that is interoperable.
So that's great. Dave, did you want to open up a conversation or direct? I know we want to talk a little bit about some potential, what's happening next. I'm interested in, how to learn from the user engagement perspective, right?
Yeah.
The kind of thing we're thinking about for consenter is different because they're not checkbox. I mean, there's a checkbox, but it's conveying information to the other person, as in terms of trying to really provide an informed consent experience. So anyway, before I dive into that, Dave, did you want to say more?
Well, I was just going to make the point, and John or Gray, if you can just say a couple of words on it, it would be wonderful. The Firefly application, the framework that builds these applications, really isn't a one-trick pony. You can build multiple different kinds of applications with it. I didn't know, John, whether you wanted to speak at all about WVEMS protocols.
Oh yeah, sure. I just to give a quick plug of the other things that we've done, and to answer your point directly, Daniel. So the questionnaires that I'm showing, that I showed that were available, where you saw that screen, I guess just here, here at the beginning. The questionnaires that we've shown here, where you essentially have them and you kind of click through them, is different from the consent questionnaire that you see at the very beginning, which kind of walks you through, this is what our project is. Next question, let's make sure all your information is up to date. Next thing, you click a button and it will bring up a separate questionnaire that essentially is walking you through those elements of consent. That's separate. And certainly there's ways that you can have this stuff that gets dynamically rendered just with text, where you don't actually have to have, it doesn't just have to be a slider or the rest. You can put the text in many, many different locations. To Dave's point, a lot of the things that we at May June have done as a whole are really seeking to try and satisfy the answers and the things that are useful for our end users and our clients. And we have this on May June's website, but we build in and out of the open source space to answer the questions that are at hand, and in a manner that can also scale. So for Western Virginia EMS, we built a application that's being used clinically by 1,200 people in 7 counties and 7 cities and 12 counties in the state of Virginia, with the ability of that same thing can now be applied to any EMS agency. And we're looking at working with almost a dozen just in that state who are excited about the stuff that they built and said, hey, can this also apply to us? And the answer is, yeah, you just have to change the content. And we can work with you to help change that content so that it gets displayed for what you need. And I think a lot of the stuff that we're doing here, that we had started with Prepare, that we built into this, is specifically so that really we can build this for whatever content is desired, and in a manner that that really can help satisfy the need. So it isn't just one age group or one clinical setting, et cetera. And a good example, if I go to an allergy, allergy clinic and I need to get my shots every month, I can, there's a questionnaire that I have to fill out, and rather than have to answer the same questions on paper every single month, you just have this. Or, if you want to fill out as like depression screening and postpartum patients in a pediatric clinic, you can use the same thing. And this isn't limited to that one setting. Are the questionnaires custom and or open or from the OpenNLM tool? Yeah, the question that I had showed there included prepare, which came, from that's from, the Loincs version of prepare. You can put in any questionnaire resource. We just have a way to make this as easy as possible to, so that, if you are not used to or familiar or comfortable with building your own fire questionnaires, which there's a lot of stuff that's involved in making sure that you actually follow that format, just like how I would not be comfortable building my own engine of a car that I drive, or, maybe I'll change the alternator, but that's probably about as far as I'll go. Other people, you can work with something that is a little more out of the box and a little more custom so that you can build this. But if you do OpenNLM and then you just make a questionnaire, it's possible to use that as well. Jim, you have your hand raised.
Well, I do, John. I think you covered this and Matt covered it, but I got a couple questions in chat on the topic of the Cures Act. And to your reference and to Matt's as well, under the Cures Act now, as of July of last year, patients are full or providers are obligated to give patients access to their information. And I want to say, and anybody here can correct me, I think that's in whatever form that they request. So if I come in and say, I want you to ship me all my patient data in HL7 fire format, I'm not sure what I would do with that, but they have to meet those requests, and they also have to meet it within whatever they prescribe to be a reasonable amount of time. So.
I don't think that's quite right. It's not in whatever format you want.
Okay.
So I think there's two different parts of that. One is, yes, they need to be able to send you here's all the paper, right? So I think that's thing one. But the other thing is the patient access. If they want another app to be able to render your healthcare data, they do specify that FHIR is the standard for representing that healthcare data. In the same way that if you have a running app and you have your you have your Android step count from your Android phone, or you have your Apple Health app, you can tell your iPhone, hey, I want you to share this step data with my running app, right? So it's that kind of principle of just this data needs to be accessible in this other app over here, and that is specified as FHIR.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that.
Yeah, and I think the other question and nuance is also not just I as consenting adult want access to my health data. I as parent want access to my teenager's health data. And then that's where things get a little more nuanced. And I think that was also some of the specific discussions that we were having for this. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of 21st Century Cures and the fact that FHIR is now our standard, because it's been a long time coming, and we as informaticians are extremely happy about this.
Or John, I'd add, and I think I think a further complicated case too is I want access to my parents' health data because I'm a caregiver and they're disabled and they're both fully legal adults, and how you set up that sort of, guardianship sharing model.
Yeah, exactly. And this is what fits with what Gray said, where the technical piece, can we apply that same thing in any of those settings? And the answer is yes, assuming it fits with the needs of the health system or the payer or the organization that we're working with, and in context of whatever state or states this is being implemented.
Yeah.
So Daniel,
just,
were you going to say something, Gray?
Yeah, well, I was just going to echo what Christine put in the chat, just make sure everyone saw, is that New Jersey has no laws about adolescent health screenings and whether or not these can be confidential. And the other piece of that, of course, is that while I obviously fully support this encouraging and the laws that are sharing the data, we also know that they are not particularly well enforced, and they're not particular fines. And even when they're supposed to be, there's lots of requirements that are by law supposed to be followed. And when you actually look at who gets punished for them, it almost never happens. So while we should continue to pursue them, it's just, the other thing is that just because the law is there does not mean that, people are automatically going to follow it. So I think that's the other thing that falls on us, is to try to, again, do this to the best of our ability, despite the laws that may or may not be there.
Thank you. And Daniel, to your point, when we first started Project Unify, one of the components that we were looking at addressing was the user experience. And I think in general, what you're seeing today is what we were talking about back then. And I think we can all see, whether it be Open City Labs or Jim St. Clair with the Linux Foundation, that additional modules can be built in to build different kinds of applications as we move forward. So we're already starting to investigate one example could be consent. I've got some meetings set up with Jim to start looking at what the Linux Foundation might be interested in and so forth, and certainly working with Matt on how this can help him achieve his goals as well. So, you know, we're starting to have those conversations. Love to loop you in on them.
Indeed, indeed. I was going to say, Gray, that it's not about the laws, it's about the lawyers. And so it would have delivered a different punch. It was a little closer to the delivery there, but you know, part of it is demonstrate, while maybe no one's getting prosecuted for it or fined yet, the fear of a county council for taking one extra pencil out of the supply cabinet is so intense that that bar for authorization around privacy and around consent practices is just so high in so many areas. Rightfully so to some areas, but it just freezes up, right? So you can get some basic information, that's great. The question is, can you bring that same sort of data fluidity actually with the data, right? One thing is on the consent side, just do you have access? Are you allowed to have access to it? This is the question we're asking. And can you control that and manage and organize that so that you have one central place that manages consents, right? All different kinds of consents. Kind of the same way you said you had 16 different, you know, questionnaires. Well, you'd have, who knows, 5 to 10 different consents, right? You're hearing about different things. I was on a fascinating webinar yesterday on basic income and the benefits cliffs and how they're trying to determine, you know, where does the benefit kick in and when does it, what's the marginal benefit, when does it disappear? Anyway, I think being able to create the kind of interface that you showed us and the ability to actually share and access to real data from different places for care coordination is, you know, you got the consent on one end, you've got the questionnaires, you know, but then how do you actually facilitate the flow of information once the consents have been approved or once the lawyers have said, yeah, okay, pass the sniff test for us. That's the big enchilada, right? And on data that's very protected, right? Not just sort of demographic information, I might say, in some ways. Not to diminish that, but so I guess one of the questions is on the back end, if you had unique laws, right? You have federal law, you have state law, you have local code, you've got interpretations and policies and all sorts of other stuff that Chris can layer onto that for the various 3, 4, 5, 6 different required legal statutes you have to manage. Do you see that same application of Dart and Flutter facilitating that process? Or is it a different bag of worms?
Yeah, I was going to say that it seems like the question is, can you build into the system all those nuances for, can you build into the flow all the nuances for all the different states that have laws on the books, you know, for who needs, who, you know, all the consent rules that we're talking about.
I think as I'm looking through this, I'll defer some of the back end discussions also to Gray as well. But as you're trying to build this out, when what we are showing from the end user's perspective, you only want to see what's there and what's right in front of you, period. That's it. And so for Flutter strictly, what should be shown probably makes the most sense to at least have that, directly tied to Fire, so that the Fire resources that you need to see are the ones that are specifically there, so that you aren't trying to render that in code on your app when the logic may change, and then you have to push updates to your app. And then what happens if that changes? I think it makes a lot of sense to use some, whenever you have these nuances and complexities of what should be shown in whatever state or whatever location that they're at, probably to have that as a back-end connection rather than something that's done on the front-end perspective. And I'll give the analogy as I know, and hopefully that would apply. So when we originally built Prepare, you saw there's two spreadsheets. So the one spreadsheet, which was literally every single language that we had all 26 languages, but it also included all of the references to every single question and every answer choice. And so from our perspective, it was great. You had this in one spreadsheet and that's it. And that's all you have to do. But then the problem was, okay, well, what if you want more than just that one questionnaire? What if you want to do something that's, PHQ-9 or something else that isn't just Prepare? How do you work with that? And because everything was ingrained into the code, into our Flutter application, it didn't make sense. It wasn't a good way to have that scale. And so that's the reason why we even have that whole separate spreadsheet that includes the language translations into Fire. Because if you're trying to render something dynamically, I see it as one of two ways. Either this is happening through some form of logic on the back end, or a package is generated that allows you to decide which of these needs to be done based on there, so that you aren't creating brand new code that's embedded into your app for every single one of these clearly nuanced iterations. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Barak, you have your hand raised.
This is more of a comment. There are some new other technologies other than Flutter that are doing very similar things that you showed. I'm working on one of those, the layered schemas, where you essentially impose the same kind of layering at the schema level. But when you do this at the schema level, the discussion that we were just having about how to actually apply consent on the back end. So what you did for Flutter on the front end can also be implemented at the back end to implement consent on the actual backend side. So that's actually something we've been working on. And yeah, I'd like to talk to you more about that, how these two can be maybe combined.
I think this actually also brings up an interesting point that that again is kind of a separate discussion, but I think some of the consent and the questions around consent are about who has the data and who controls it and where it should live. And again, this is not specifically for today's discussion, but just I think we're at a point where at some point it's worth the discussion about who should have the data and where you should control it from. And should it be a central repository where we have your data and then you have to ask us permission to give your data out to groups or permit other people to have it? Or should you control most of it and we ask your permission when we want to access it? And I think there's some discussion to be had around this. And I specifically bring it up because one of the other groups that we work with that also does a lot of development in mobile apps in Flutter created actually a secure protocol around mobile and sharing at any level you want, any of the data that you have that is stored. And then when someone wants access, they request permission from you and you can give them any layered access. with it. So again, I think there's some options out there and some answers, but it's I realize it's a separate discussion, but I just wanted to bring it up because I think it's something that is worth having the discussion about, because I think we're at the stage where there's a possibility of rethinking some of this.
I think Barack's point about there being other ways of implementing consent is illustrative of one of the larger challenges, which is that there is no agreed upon standards around consent. Well, yes, we have fire consent as a resource, but if you look at what actually gets implemented by EHRs and is kind of something that could be supported across a true ecosystem, consent is not in US CDI 3, V3. It's not in US Core. And as a result, every EHR will have its own rules of how it enables a caregiver to access their child's medical records. So, and then in addition, most data is exchanged under treatment, payment, and operations. And so much of the ecosystem is saying, hey, we don't need, why do we need to implement consent? Because it's all data exchange. We're recording it in our own proprietary way in our system when consent is required. We're just not exchanging it, right, to something like a consent utility, right? So as a result, until you a first step towards moving the entire industry towards would be to include consent in US Core. That's that would be there's a lot of solutions out there that can solve the problem if you could just get everybody to agree to how the standard of how you're going to tackle the issue.
I would like to add another comment here. That's something I've been saying in other groups as well. Getting everybody to agree on something is not possible as far as I can tell. But being able to operate in an environment where multiple standards exist and cross-talk between those standards is enabled, it should be the way to go. And in terms of consent as well, and in general interoperability, everybody's trying to work on FHIR, but that is essentially your representational interoperability. It's not semantic interoperability. Still, even if you're talking FHIR with two parties, you may not be saying the same thing. And that's what we are actually working on right now, to find technical solutions to bring this to a semantic interoperability level, so that even if you get two FHIR messages that talk about the same thing in different languages, you understand the same thing. Some of them give you things in loin code, some of them give you in SNOMED codes, and sometimes we get regular text for the same thing, but they all mean the same thing. That is the actual interoperability challenge here. Just moving everything to FHIR or just presenting a uniform interface is not going to solve the real back-end problem that we are facing.
And to be clear, USCDI does not point at FHIR. USCDI just says, here are the semantic definitions of the things that all certified EHRs need to support. And consent right now is not one of the things that needs to be supported in USCDI. That would just be a step, one step.
Yeah, and I can't help but bring up, Barack and I have been involved in some of the same specifications groups where we talked about this and dug into the sort of things Barack has. But as we brought up in this group too, the other problem with the technology is that you have to deal with the manner of consent management, i.e., you don't want constant consent fatigue of I enable a granular consent mechanism that then gives me 50 pop-ups saying yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, and scanning through all this information. And that's another, both not only technology challenge, but kind of a socio-cultural challenge in managing that too.
Well, I think one of the challenges is the mighty and few controllable information sources, right? Not sources, but that handful of information that is so, sensitive versus other kinds of data that actually might not need to be held to that same standard of control.
That's well said, Dan. And I think part of the challenge too is because we don't have a uniform look at it, because there are social cultural problems, we haven't just sorted out to get common denominators of data or degrees of acceptance to say, I'll always allow this percentage. I want to be involved in decisions on this percentage. You know, you can know my kids' data except for A, B, and C, and I want to be involved in that. And then Rita brought up the point about using the term control of data, and I offered back that there's confusion between ownership of your data and control of your data, and what the law allows for each state for that. And then, of course, circumstances surrounding behavioral data and how that's shared. So you know, we just have to have these kind of messy discussions, in my opinion, to be able to sort these things out at a policy level.
Yeah, I have to say, in all the talk and discussions we've had about consent, the obvious things that we had to think about, mental health record, you know, like psych records, SUD records, all of that, it didn't occur to me about the deeper, bigger issues. Like, it's in and of itself, it's a whole thing about minors and how that's going to vary by state. That's like a whole other deep quagmire. Or you could put a positive spin on it and say challenge.
You're right. And there's some other technologies we've looked at too, Chris, around rules engines. And some of the applications we're looking at rules engines right now are like vaccine data, so that the EU recognizes my vaccine data that's coming from Canada as I'm flying to the US, blah, blah, blah. But I think some of the process flow there is similar, which is what kind of rules engine you put in, so that between knowing, you know, New Jersey accepts this, but New York doesn't accept that, or New York requires this, and New Jersey doesn't accept that, and how in that process the machine rules make an adjustment for you.
Yeah, because even if I think about if we figure out the whole standardized process that we've talked about with consent, like some universal law that addresses all this language, there are always going to be certain this is just one area that I can see that states are still going to differ. You know, like, even if we get people on board with the idea of like general, you know, like one way of looking at health data in particular, or trying to expand a little farther than that, there are always going to be these little nuances for protected categories. Yeah, so I learned a lot today. Thank you. I gotta go.
Yeah, we're approaching double overtime. No, I think that's 6 o'clock is double overtime. Well, the question continues to heat up around how to really grapple with it. I continue to be hopeful and optimistic that we're moving in the right, you know, we're moving in a positive direction, connecting more and more of the pieces to get to a big enough scale to be able to move the flywheel forward a little bit. Feels like that maybe happening. Hopefully, as you know, throughout the year, be able to pull them together. So with that, I think unless there's other sort of thoughts, people usually add their thoughts to their reserve. So I think this was really helpful to think about the solution of an approach to the problems, how interconnected they are. So I just, floor is open for a moment. If anyone wants to add something that's coming up or interesting or useful or question. Now is a moment. Kathy, you're saying something, your mic's up.
Thank you, Daniel. Just noting, I did spend part of the afternoon watching some of ONC's annual meeting session 1 content today. There's more sessions tomorrow afternoon, and then the second group of sessions will be in April. So if anybody's, they're mostly a lot of information sharing tech, and public health related stuff, but just in case you might want to go look at what's on.
Was it TAFCA related?
Some of it was TAFCA related, some of it was public health support related. A lot of it was very technical on the TAFCA related stuff. So I don't know if anybody's interested. There were more sessions tomorrow afternoon and then a bunch more in April. So just thought I'd mention it.
Thanks for raising that. Jim, I think you and I were talking about that, or I think one conversation this week around, because the movement around TAFCA now may allow us to sort of wave the flag a little bit more, right? So that some of the work applies in addition to the healthcare stuff, all the other areas we're talking about. Were we talking about that?
You and I were talking about it yesterday. That's why I just threw that comment in the chat.
Yeah.
And, you know, there, for Rita and myself and others working on the patient identity side, there's still ways to go on patient identity in TEFCA, but there's no language addressing consent and how to build consent into the TEFCA model, which, you know, QHINs are all about maximizing the efficiencies of information sharing, but with no discussion of consent as part of that.
Yeah. And I think I shared with everybody last week that there's a new toolkit out from CMS and ACF on between data sharing between the CMMI, I'm sorry, the Medicaid Management Information Systems, MMISs, and child welfare systems, the new child welfare systems, in that sort of reaffirmation that this is good to do. Please do it. It's okay in some ways. But explicitly, there's a lot of specificity around pieces of it, but not around consent, except to point out that, you know, consent goes here in the box, right? You got to figure that out. So maybe
that's a great point, because if you think about the socioeconomic strata most affected by a child welfare MMIS integration, that's the one that I think we would want to make sure we get the issue of dynamic consent and consent management right and easy.
This is absolutely true. Absolutely.
It's unlikely that you'll get consent right, given that Congress loves to do things in different bills and codify stuff at the federal level, which then has to, you know, drip down to states and so on. And, you know, basically the land of the law basically is the widest berth. The states can add restrictions, but they cannot undo what you know, Congress has said from a statute perspective. So you know, you're always going to have these problems of Congress doing goofy, crazy things with very little input, and then sending it out there, and the folks on the ground have to try to figure out how to implement it. So as long as we have that kind of rule-based law, you're going to have problems trying to implement it.
I will dream of a Tesla and will aim for a Yugo.
Yeah, well, you know, if you dream for a Tesla and get a Yugo, well, you know what you got now.
You still get to drive to Walmart. That's exactly right.
Possibly. Possibly.
Depends how much stuff you can put in the trunk. That's the real.
Well,
right.
Depends on if it gets you there or not.
But Ken, you know, states have done a tremendous job complicating it even further. So, you know, my experience talking with states is like, all right, you got your federal laws, that's fine, great. You know, just help us clarify already. But then, yeah, if you look at basically blue states have just ratcheted up the, you know, the requirements and the constraints on it. It's even harder. So.
Yeah, well, that's the point. I mean, states can make it, you know, more specific and more difficult to implement than the federal level, where they just, you know, give you general guidelines on what you can and can't do.
Right.
So you know, and then if 50 states write 50 different rules on how you're supposed to operate within the federal guidelines, then, you know, that complicates the problem immensely.
Yes, we've chosen something not so easy to address. A lifetime of work that way.
Well, but if you look at part 2, for example, I don't believe there's one court case that dealt with part 2.
Well, our attorneys are keeping us from that abject situation.
Yeah, but
Don't let you
see,
get there.
you know,
Just don't share it. Just don't share it.
To adjudicate a part 2 case, it has to go to an attorney general that, you know, has to figure out if they want to prosecute the case or not. Doesn't go to regular lawyers unless, you know, a case goes to court, right? But there is no case law that I'm aware of that deals with part 2. And the reason is because the attorney general looks at it and says, I got to do all this work and get $500 fine for it, you know, and say, no, thank you. It goes to the bottom of the pile. I got multi-million-dollar cases I got to deal with that, you know, $500 doesn't tip the bucket at all, right? So now, you know, when they've just changed part 2, right, in one of the big omnibus laws that they passed and made it a opt-in, opt-out process, but no facility to figure out, you know, how you manage opt-ins and opt-outs across states and so on and so forth, right?
Well, I would submit that you know, intrastate is sufficiently difficult to do that. But I'm going to ask Kathy to weigh in for a second, because even that's opt-in, opt-out, is, you know, you're still going to ask for specificity. And
Specificity of what? Your choice is you either opt in to share information or you opt out. There's no specificity whatsoever in that decision.
Right. And same with access via consent to HIE data in New York State. Once you sign that consent, you get access to everything. If you don't sign it, you get access to nothing.
Exactly.
This is the issue I've raised about to PP2PI, because they're focused on granular segmentation and tagging of things that, you know, it's just incredibly difficult to even conceive of how we could handle that level of segmentation in any of our systems at this point.
Right.
And particularly, I mean, given that our system and, you know, most of the part 2 consent to share is all directed at the provider community. You know, it's certainly always been my opinion and the opinion of most of my provider colleagues I've worked with for 40 years on and off, that, you know, providers respect patient confidentiality and that they provide better care when they know as much as there is to know about a patient. You know, if they're shut out because a patient is scared to disclose something, but the provider's still going to keep it confidential, you know, I sort of err on a system that says the provider should have access because they'll give better care and they'll keep it confidential. And if not, they'll get in big trouble.
And, you know, if you have to do an opt-in, how do you manage that across states, right? You know, if somebody opts in New York, you know, and then they go on vacation to California and then they get sick or whatever, where's the opt-in work?
Well, actually, Ken, we're working on a solution to that right now in New York, because it created a situation for us where we couldn't participate fully in any of the national data sharing networks like Care Equality,
Right.
eHealth Exchange. And so we're in the process now of developing a consent model that will have the patient sign a consent if they want to, that gives them, that essentially is giving the New York Shiny participants consent to access their data through the Shiny, and data that is provided from any current or future healthcare provider or health plan anywhere. So that if they sign what we're calling this all-in consent, then we could wind up, sharing data with the Health Exchange or Care Equality and having it go both ways, having New York data go out of state, which it currently hasn't been able to do. So lots of challenges on the road to implementing this, but it seems to be the model that's still opt-in, but also much more universal in what it allows for sharing.
Oh, good luck with that.
Thank you.
Kathy, I think HIEs are probably the best candidate for implementing a consent utility because they have the most expertise in the area of consent.
I would agree. Oh, well, those of us who deal with opt-in, the folks who deal with opt-out have had a pretty easy life of it in that sense. But, they're certainly, they have to deal with it for part 2. So there's always infrastructure on some level to deal with it, but some of them just have dealt with it by not including part 2 data in what they bring in and allow access to. So
just maybe a question for next time is, I'm just thinking if there's any lessons learned from the prescription drug monitoring programs, which are now, I think, in all states, and how they, I'm sure Justice is sharing PDMP data across state lines, regionally, if not nationally. Oh, Mark was just getting out. He might have been the person to answer the question. That's why he's jumping off. Anyway, I don't know if it has relevance to it, but they've cracked the code of, or they're certainly implemented across the country, right? And I think actually Carol, and they've done some work on consent within that world. Interesting model to look at. Anybody familiar with the PDMP?
I don't think you need a consent for the PDMP to work.
I don't know.
Your data goes through state exchanges from a PDMP perspective. There's no consent or anything considered from a PDMP perspective. And yeah, they may be state-based, but still in all, there's no patient consent required to share information. And in fact, it's mandatory to share information most places to a PDMP.
Right, and it's mandatory to do the lookup.
Yep.
But it's an interesting question about whether PDMPs share data across state lines, or what's the universe of data they have access to, because that, they ought to, particularly for, use of providers who are, located in places where people often cross from one state to another for care.
Yep.
Yeah,
and I believe PDMP share across states.
I would think so, but I don't know much about how they actually work.
Right. I won't stake my life on it, but I'm pretty sure they share across state lines, especially states that are, have boundaries with other states, right?
Yeah, I would hope so.
Yeah.
Same Paul isn't on the call. I'll pose that question to him because he designed that, helped design the original system to IGES. All right, folks.
Well, great meeting. Thanks.
We will see you next week. We had Kay was supposed to speak, but she had an emergency. She's not gonna be able to do it. So not sure what the topic is. Maybe we'll some other topics of discussion we'll bring to the conversation. So be well, everybody.
Bye.
All right, bye.
Thank you.